Well, I'm Flora Samuel, and I was professor and head of school at Sheffield from the years 2009 to 2015. So I was the first female head of the Sheffield's School of Architecture, which was a great honour and a big challenge, actually, because the school was going through very radical change at that time. I think I should say a little bit about how I got to be head at Sheffield School of Architecture. The way my career went, I was a practicing architect and I had children, and having children and being a practicing architect is really hard. And I always enjoyed the academic side of things. And I went and started teaching at the South Bank University at that time, which had a course on women into architecture. It was a foundation course targeting minority groups, and was really a very inspiring experience for me, teaching history. And so I was very, very, when I was teaching architectural history to minority women, many of them mothers, and returning to work, it became apparent that the way we teach history of architecture is, well, the way I was taught was just terrible. It was very, very, there was no place for women in it whatsoever. And where women were there, they were usually referred to, I mean, a particularly bad example is Adolf Loos, you know, they are very sexualized and not taken seriously. So that was when I became very, I really realized there was something very wrong in my own education. Well, I was always very critical of my own education. And I went into the world of academia, and my first job was at Cardiff University, where I was the first woman to teach on staff to teach design studio, the first woman to run a studio year. And then I got a job at Bath, where I think I was the only woman on staff, and I was the first woman to run an MArch at Bath. So I just give these as context for quite a challenging situation for women in academia around that period of the 1990s into the early thousands. And so I was very delighted when I got the job at Sheffield, because I'd always been a huge admirer of Sheffield and its feminist and its political approach. So as I mentioned before, Sheffield at the time I was catapulted into the job was at a time, I suppose it was after the global financial crash, and this university was suffering very much from financial issues, because Sheffield as a university was built on penny donations, and it's never been rich in any shape or form, and it's not built on very expensive real estate or anything like that. So real challenge when I became head was almost immediately to pretty much have to halve the operational budget that we were working on. And we also moved out of the Arts Tower into Crooksmoor while the Arts Tower was done up, and then we moved back in. That also had its own challenges. So for me, as a feminist, the critical thing in leading the School of Architecture was being transparent and sharing decision-making with everybody across the team. And this had not happened up to this point. The school had been largely led by, well, amazing group of female administrators who were very powerful and amazing, getting close to retirement. And me being the first female head, I kind of wanted to do things more collaboratively. And so I think I was the first person to share the budgets, transparently, all the financial budgets of the school, so people knew where they were and what was going on, and that I wasn't doing shady dealings, moving money between different people. And another thing was empowering people at the lowest levels of the hierarchy who had to ask for permission, say, to buy a printer cartridge. My mission was around giving them a budget and giving them power and autonomy. And these are very much coming from my own dislike of injustice and dislike of hierarchies, really. So I was very much trying to help the school to be more kind of collaborative and open in the way it worked. It's a difficult thing with head of school, because the head of school is always the head. The university wants one person, a point of contact around all their decision making. But as a team, we really started to make something very nice happen during that period that I was head. And people like Doina Petrescu, they absolutely got it. They absolutely knew what I was doing. And so part of my mission was to get people promoted. Many people have been sitting in the same position for a long, long time. So I was very pleased during the period I was there. I got 26 people promoted in various shapes or forms, which I think is a world record from what I'm from people I'm experiencing now, including Doina to professor, because she so obviously should have been a professor, and Irena Bauman, who was just she was a design studio teacher, and she got her in as professor as well. So around that period, then we had this amazing, we had Doina, Irena, we had Sarah Wigglesworth, and then we were joined by Fionn Stevenson. So this was a quite exceptional group of female professors. And it was very inspiring. And I realized looking back on it, it was an amazing situation. So during the period that I was head, 2009 to 2015, the feminist approach there was really, I think, about making feminist ways of working within the organization of the school. That was the primary thing for me, for empowering people and hopefully giving them more of a voice, and for thinking very carefully about their career paths and where they might go. At the same time, I mean, we had clearly feminist work going on with people like Sarah Wigglesworth and Doina, of course, and Irena's work as well. And I think one of the things that united us, and it got me onto a whole new area, was a belief in a way in the power of research, that the research provides evidence that can be used to help the less powerful, in a sense. And then this very much builds on the ideas of people like Matrix, who gathered research in order to make the case for the fact there are people out there and their needs are not being delivered. And this was a huge thing for me. And I think that was very much what, in a way, where we were all coming from. And a realization that you had to be kind of, I mean, I found the very theoretical and philosophical world that Doina is part of very, very amazing and fascinating. But I'm very much pragmatic, hands-on. I wanted to get involved in industry. And this is a nice thing. I think Irena was like that too. So there were some people that well, Doina is very pragmatic too. I mean, that's one of the remarkable things about her. So, but there was this sort of double-sided thing between theory and also practice in the real world. So in terms of my influence on the school's feminist agenda when I was head of school, I think I hope it was in terms of changing the structures of the ways that the hierarchies in the school worked, the way we did meetings, the way lots of the leadership across the whole group was thoroughly shared, and the way that money was allocated to different modules was transparent and as fair as we could possibly make it. Yeah, so that was really, I hope, where my feminist agenda came in. I think also there's an element around acknowledging and the lived experience of people. When I was at Sheffield, I was commuting from Cardiff. I had to commute from Cardiff because I have 3 children. My husband was looking after the children, which enabled me to do this job. And I've always done these leadership roles in the great acknowledgement that people they have family responsibilities, they have other caring responsibilities, they have many other things in their lives. And I tried to make the place somewhere a bit more humane, where people could work, where long hours culture is was absolutely not not tolerated, really, and certainly not working at weekends, and trying to get a sort of I know that architecture students always work really long hours, but to try and offer a more humane way of working as well. regarding my memories about the feminist work at the Sheffield School of Architecture, a specific moment or aspect about this, well, I mean, there are many legendary moments in the history of the school. There's the legendary moment when Jeremy Till had made the school into a feminist school for the day, and people had tutorials in the stairwells and all sorts of exciting things happened. And I think that there were, for me, epic moments were things like when Doina Petrescu was given her professorship and she did her inaugural lecture on her work. That was a very exciting moment, very well attended. Likewise, Fionn, when she came in, for these to me were epic moments. And the professorial, the professors in the school were given an opportunity to run lecture series. So we had lecture series from people led by people like Sarah, which brought a variety of interesting people into the school that weren't normally there. But really, I think the feminist aspect of it all for me was, again, coming back to the school being run very largely by women, which was very unusual. And with women in many key roles, and working in an extremely unhierarchical way with the administrative staff, who were all fantastic. So for me, that's the sort of the really special, specific moments of things. We had, we had lots of lovely parties and all those food. Maybe that's feminist, I don't know. Sheffield's always been great for having food and parties, and the lunchtime specials and the sharing. I don't know if that's feminist or not, but it was lovely in that respect. So in terms of the legacy of my experience at Sheffield School of Architecture, my current activity, well, it's been absolutely immense. I was having a bit of I was changing while I was at Sheffield from being a historian really into somebody who was examining this issue of value, what values and what's valued in the policy and planning agenda and in housing. And this has become my whole research world ever since. I've become, I wrote the Social Value Toolkit for Architecture, because I believe that the whole of the way the policy and neoliberal system that we exist in planning, it's all gauged on monetary value. And there's some fantastic writers like Mariana Mazzucato who've written about this sort of thing. But we have to bring in new kinds of value systems. So my area has been social value and developing methodologies for evidencing it, mapping it. Mapping is a very, very Sheffield thing. I learned a lot about mapping in Sheffield, and actually indeed quantifying it. And this is, so my work in this area is really growing a lot of impetus around major developments around planning, how planning has to be more digital, has to be more democratic, and while combining face-to-face. The future, I mean, we have to make planning more democratic. And for me, this is around mapping and including social value maps into the way we think about the world. So all of that was very much coming from Sheffield work, and Nishat's Nishat Awan's incredible work on mapping. Doina, with the Rurban project, the way that she mapped and evidenced the flows of energy, food, all those sorts of things, very much influenced by her. The way that the participatory work that went on in school through the live projects. And I should say, it was during this period that we managed to get live works funded. We managed to put the idea to the university as a sort of place for university and community and industry research to happen. So the idea of an urban room, which is what live works is another thing that we're developing where I am now. I should say that I left, in a way, I left Sheffield, but in a way because we were so, in a way, comfortable as a bunch of very interesting women in the school, not just at professor level, but at multiple levels. And in a way, it seemed almost too easy. And actually, I began to feel that I needed to be my kind of, I've always had a very strong impetus to try and initiate change. And I felt there was only so far I could go in Sheffield. And actually, I needed to put myself out there into a new context which is why I moved to the University of Reading, where we set up a new school of architecture. And I should say, so it's run by Lorraine Farrelly and we're the only two professors. And at one point, we must have been the only all-female school of architecture in the world. I think there is one in Saudi Arabia, but we only had female staff. And this school has been built very much on the agenda that I personally started to develop, which works well with Lorraine's work around evidence, encouraging practices to do research, developing evidence and learning on how to do things better. This Fionn Stevenson's world of post-occupancy evaluation. And this all, for me, cascades back into the world of matrix and those evidence-based people who were working in local authorities like Haringey back in the 80s, before they were shut down. Now, feminists have a very vexed relationship with quantitative data and quantitative measurements, and there's a lot of debate in feminist discourse around this. But for me, I believe that you have to name things, and I think this is part of Sarah Wigglesworth's work. You have to name things to bring them out into the open in order to make change. And this is what, in my world, around kind of categorizing, naming, measuring things, I'm interested in bringing them out so that they're taken seriously by policy and local authorities and other people. And once they've become taken seriously, then we can dissolve the categories, and we've moved into a new way of being, and where people understand things like social value are really important, well-being, quality of life. And I think we're at a moment like that when that's starting to happen. So I believe that you use quantifiable data and categorizations and data sets in a very guarded way to affect change. But ultimately, we shouldn't need to have data on why it makes a difference to be kind to one another and to care. This is a really sad thing that in this audit culture that we live in, that we have to do that. But unfortunately, to make the change happen, we need to work in that evidence-based way. So this kind of things, these are influences that have gone right into our teaching at Reading, where the whole curriculum is based on facilitating students to become researchers, to feel empowered. They get practice teaching all the way through their course, because so that they feel empowered to make change and they feel empowered to become entrepreneurial. I think that was one of the great things about Sheffield, that it encouraged an entrepreneurial spirit in students, which was excellent. But unfortunately, I believe that everybody needs to understand money if they're going to make a difference in the world, for good or ill. And this was one of the reasons why it was very good for me to come to Reading, where there's a very strong real estate world that I'm sort of embed myself and critique. So I should say also that my work with on evidencing, on value, it led to the publication of my book, Why Architects Matter, which was about how the profession has failed to demonstrate its evidence. And this is one of the reasons why architects are not taken seriously, and one of the reasons that architecture is so bad, because they're paid so little. They can't go the extra mile to make better places for communities and so on. And I developed that work while I was, I did a lot of work in the Royal Institute of British Architects, including being the first vice president for research at the RIBA, trying to get this agenda of practice research, post-occupancy. And I think to some extent we succeeded. During that period when I was involved in the RIBA, they'd published a new code of conduct, which was important, and documentation on ethics and sustainability, things that hadn't really been thought about very much. So there are definite positive things happening in the institution at the time. Really, well, from my point of view, coming from what I had been up to at Sheffield. So what are the main impacts of feminist pedagogy in students' future practice? Well, I suppose it always comes back down to feminist pedagogy and what that might be. But for me, as I said, it comes back to this sort of evidence-based way of working, back to people like Matrix and Haringey Council Housing Department, that you are gathering data on what people need, and often on what people who are in difficult situations really need. And I think that, so in the way that I teach now, our students are fully, they're taught about how to develop social value mapping, social value measuring, right from year one, actually, in the school. And they're developing this, starting as we move through the school, they're starting to look at the social value impact of the projects that they're developing as they go through. And this is really coming to fruition in the MArch, where mapping, post-occupancy, social value are really very much part of our agenda. And again, whether you could call those things feminist, I don't know, but they came to me. I learned about them when I was at Sheffield, and it was part of the feminist pedagogical approach there. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question. What is a feminist pedagogical approach? Other things that's striking about feminist, for me, about the feminist research approaches is the idea of personal is political, bringing your own personal self into things that you do. And I think in the way that I would encourage students in the way that they write, to be not excluding their own personal narrative, their lived embodied experience. This is absolutely part of who they are. And it is in itself an incredible research tool, the body, your body, my body, you know, this is through which we filter the world. And there was a beautiful dissertation written by Nisha Awan, actually, when she was a student, which I think was commended for the RIBA Awards, which was her experience of being a Bangladeshi immigrant, but also it was done as an objective writing, accompanied by writing sort of in italics on the side, which was about her own experience and her mother's experience of the world, embodied experience, and that was very beautiful. So I think always remembering that people are whole people. They're not just sort of machines for doing research or producing architecture. I hope that's, and for caring about people's mental health, and for understanding that we're all in different life stages. I mean, I hope that that's what I try, a caring and supportive attitude. I hope that's what I achieve in the way that I teach going forward. And I think what we instill in our students to look after themselves, not to overwork, and to have a life, really. They can't get out and work, make architecture unless they know what it's like to be living a life amongst non-architects, and using languages that non-architects speak. So democratizing the whole thing in that way. Based on my experience, how I define the current situation of architectural education in relation to feminist pedagogy. Well, that's really interesting, because at the moment, because of Brexit, the RIBA has been able to rewrite its educational agenda. I've been extremely critical of the RIBA validation educational agenda, which has no mention in it of things like participatory techniques, listening to people, doing research, very, very, so, and had a huge emphasis on things like learning about the history of art and stuff like that. So I think the RIBA has now put up a new statement about, so the RIBA has put up a new plan for how education will be going forward. And this is values-based, really. And research is very much part of it. And for as far as I can see, this research agenda absolutely has the practice-based research agenda, evidence-based, post-occupancy, has its absolute origins within Sheffield School of Architecture. I mean, and also not only in the amazing work that has been done by staff there, but also in the writings of Jeremy Till around what is research and what is research in practice. These have been really fundamental framings of how the profession should develop and how architectural education should develop as well. So, and again, it comes back to what we mean by feminist pedagogy, but if we mean evidence and we mean collaboration and we mean listening and we mean caring and we mean offering people routes into being an architect, which are more humane than 5 years very, very expensive education, offering alternative routes into education, then I think all these things are starting to come to fruition really through the radically changing institutional educational agenda. But Sheffield has always been the absolute leader on the whole live project scene. It's been doing live projects longer than anybody. And again, if liveness is feminist, then I think Sheffield's contribution Sheffield's contribution has been enormous to the whole live projects. It's legendary across the globe. And that again comes from a desire to include people and to make things together in a collaborative, non-hierarchical way. So how will a future feminist school of architecture look like? Well, that's a really different, interesting question. I mean, I'm writing a book at the moment on the future. What would a future housing system look like? So I'm thinking about what a housing system would look like in a situation, which I'm hoping we are leading towards, where the current market-led economy, neoliberal economy, draws to a close because it's not working. The neoliberal economy is absolutely not working for housing, for inclusion, for health. And the neoliberal economy is heading us down the most terrifying path of climate change and social unrest. So I'm hoping that, the neoliberalism has only been here really since 1979 or whenever Mrs. Thatcher came in. It's not been there forever. So I'm hoping that we can get back to a situation which discredits neoliberalism, because we're going to have so few resources after the pandemic that we've got to use our resources well. So I suppose a future feminist school of architecture really needs to sit within ideally within a non-marketized architectural profession, an architectural profession which is also built on delivering not only economic value, but environmental value and social value. And by social value, I mean connecting people together, giving them opportunities to connect with nature, to care with one another, have healthy lifestyles, and also to have power and autonomy in where they live and so on. So that, I think, would have to be a context for making a future feminist school of architecture, although a feminist school of architecture can nudge that context into being. And in a sense, that's what Sheffield has always been doing. It's been an amazing exemplar for the kinds of things that were possible. So I think, because I wrote a paper on education for resilience when we were starting the school at Reading, I wrote a paper called Education for Uncertainty. And we thought very long and hard about what, and this was Lorraine and I, on what a good education would be, because a good education for architecture students is one that prepares them for all manner of different kinds of careers. And so sort of reflecting back on that, I think that a feminist school of architecture in the future has to be one where there are no marks. There are no marks and no hierarchies, because this is deeply unhealthy, and it encourages comparison, which is, and as we know, architecture is very subjective, and we develop in very different levels. And I think that the marking of projects and is totally counterproductive and against feminism personally. So I have issues with things like special awards for women in architecture, because I believe that women, that's just buying into a system that's made by men, in a sense, harking back to the ideas of people like Camille Paglia, a feminist theorist like that. So I think a feminist school of architecture will be one which will encourage people to develop their own ability to judge their own work, their own confidence in their sense of self and who they are and what they want from their lives. And so as they develop clarity about their own personal direction, the school will support them in doing projects that scaffold onto that learning and help them raise themselves and test themselves to develop into further arenas. I mean, I think a feminist school of architecture, for me, well, whether it's feminist, any school of architecture, it ought to be somewhere that really helps people to develop as human beings, that gives them a holistic education as a human being, and helps them to develop themselves. So I think a feminist school of architecture, and this is again building on what we've been up to at Reading, is very clear on what it's trying to deliver. Many schools of architecture are they do so much, they ask students to do so many things, the students just end up exhausted and nobody really knows why they did it in the first place. And actually research shows that if you give students quite tight structures within which to work, they're able to be more creative. People like Anthony Giddens have written about this. And I've seen it, I could see this time and time again. So a feminist school of architecture will be very clear about what it's doing, what people are learning, why they're learning it, how they're learning it, and when they learn it. So that students are absolutely know and what they need to do. I'm a fan of the ideas of the French Marxist sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who writes about doxic knowledge. And doxic knowledge is the knowledge that people don't talk about, the things that are never talked about, but actually are the things that help you to advance in life. And it's very particularly difficult for minorities, whether they're women or racial minorities or whatever kind of minority. It's very difficult for them to learn how to speak the doxic knowledge to advance themselves. So for me, a feminist school of architecture is one that's very clear, because it means that there's not much room for the doxic in life, because marking schedules are really clear. Well, so I'm not having any markings, but outcomes are very clear. This is what you're expected to do. And within that, you can innovate and be free. I also believe a feminist school of architecture has to be extremely relevant to practice. I think a feminist school of architecture is always going to have diversity and inclusion at its core. So having a feminist school of architecture shouldn't really cost anything to be there. A feminist school of architecture should be free. And more schools of architecture are starting to develop models with practice that are enabling students to work and learn at the same time. A feminist school of architecture will prepare students for their next stage in their life. Research shows that if you are poorly prepared to enter the job market, you can have a real trauma at that moment of entering a job, which can have impact on you a long way down through your life. So I believe that it will soften the transition into the working world. In a way, it will be permeable, completely permeable with the outside world. It might not even have a base. It won't have a pompous building. It's more like maybe one of Doyner's kind of rhizomatic networks, probably something like that. Yeah, so, but it's a place of care. It's a place where people are cared for and they are nurtured and they are supported to be the best possible people that they can be. So for me, that's really what a feminist school of architecture has to be ultimately. And I'm thinking here of people like Kim Trogel's PhD thesis on the culture of care. I think that's ultimately really where it's all at.